So I've opened up the keying project from our Program 1 Keying and Roto folder. Of course, you should do the same. Inside here we'll find 7 folders, each of which will contain a separate composition that'll explain a separate principle of keying. I've also taken the liberty of docking the effects palette with the tools palette and getting rid of everything else on screen so that we can keep things nice and neat. Those are the only palettes we're going to be using during this lesson. And I'll also be tabbing those palettes away and bringing them back again. Sometimes with the tab key, sometimes by hitting Control 1 for tools or Control 5 for effects, Command 1 or Command 5 on the Mac. Now, a lot of the scenes that we're going to be assembling here are actually scenes from the Total Training commercial that you can find elsewhere on the DVD. If you go back to the menu item and click on About Total Training, you can actually watch this finished commercial, which has a whole bunch of blue screen and green screen work done in it, so you can see the finished version of all this stuff. We're going to be using a lot of that source footage, plus a few other clips besides. This particular shot involves Steve Holmes, of course, who we are going to shrink down into miniature and place him on a podium. The podium will be in front of this blurred out applauding crowd. The podium looks like this. We're going to key out this green. And we've got a screenshot on the computer as well that we had to corner pin in. And of course, we're going to key out and color correct Steve so that he's standing on the podium next to the PowerBook that we saw there. Now, there are several steps involved in most keying jobs you'll find yourself doing. Maybe 1 or 2 of these steps might be skipped depending on how footage is shot or how footage is digitized. But in general, each keying job is going to involve some variation on these steps. These steps include drawing a garbage mat if necessary. They include, of course, keying out the color that you see in an attempt to leave the foreground object against a transparent background. They also include removing what's known as spill from the foreground object, so any tinge of color that's left behind after the initial keying process will also get removed. And then there's typically a color correction pass involved as well. Now, of course, on top of that, the sky's the limit. You can do all sorts of effects things like adding fake drop shadows or distortions or whatever you need to do to sell the shot. But those are some of the basic things that are typically involved in effects shots. Let's take a quick tour of pulling a decent key from this clip, and we're going to use some of the After Effects production bundle filters that have been in After Effects for several generations. These are very, very good filters, and I'm going to use them to very quickly illustrate a keying job. But then for the most of the rest of this lesson, we're actually going to be focusing on a new After Effects plugin bundled with the After Effects Pro version, and of course, that's the Keylight plugin. So we're going to be concentrating mostly on the filters in the keying folder that you see here and the filters in its neighboring folder, the matte tools. We're going to start out with these. So step 1 in our keying job here, if we take a quick look at our scene here, you'll see on the left-hand side of our screen, we've got this black line that's typical of a lot of video captured stuff. You often end up with these black lines that need to be dealt with. We also have a little piece of equipment junk down here in the lower left-hand corner. And off to the right, we have some lighting equipment also peeking in here as well. This is all stuff that we don't want to try to remove parametrically. We don't want to try to remove this with a filter or with keying. We just want to mask that stuff out. We want to do that with what's called a garbage mat. And the quickest and easiest way to draw one is just with the mask tools that you've seen in other lessons. So we're going to grab our pen tool from the tool palette. Let me tab the palettes away. And I'll click here in our window to activate our topmost layer. And then let me just draw a very, very quick mask that extends out into the edge and masks off all of this extra junk that we don't want to bother trying to key. Now, it's usually a very good idea, once you've drawn the garbage mat, to drag through the timeline and make sure that you haven't accidentally created a mat where the foreground character goes out of it. Maybe if they wave their hand or something like that, it might go outside of the mat. That's a fairly common thing to happen. We haven't run into that problem at all in this circumstance, as it happens. So now that we've created our garbage mat, the next step is to add one of our keying tools. Now, one of my favorite keying tools is a very, very simple tool to use, but it produces very professional results as long as you've shot things well, which we talked about in the opening section, and that's the linear color key. So I'm just going to grab the linear color key and drag it onto our layer here. I'll tab my palettes away, and let me bring our screen over a little bit so we can see both it and our effects palette. Now, by default, you can see that the filter is doing something. It's actually creating transparency where the blue exists on screen. It's obviously not creating enough transparency. And in fact, so I can see these edges a little more clearly, let me click on our comp window here and turn off masks. I'm just going to click on the mask switch here so that we're not looking at those yellow masks all the time. But what we're going to do is start by choosing our eyedropper. And even though it looks like we've got a nice saturated blue picked down here in our color chip, it may not be the perfect blue. We want to find a nice medium lit, fully saturated blue in the little thumbnail that we see over here and just click. When we do, it's going to create a somewhat better mask than what we had before. There's still a little bit of background down here around the feed. If you look closely, you'll see that I've got a little bit of that going on down there. So I can choose the eyedropper with the plus sign next to it and click down here in the color chip and see if I can get away with getting rid of a little bit more of that. And I have. I've gotten rid of most of it. I'm going to leave it there for now because I can get rid of more of this stuff with another filter we're going to be applying in just a second. I'm going to call this OK. We've gotten rid of most of the blue. Now the next step is to suppress this edge of blue that you can pretty clearly see around our character here. He was shot against a blue screen, and what you're seeing here is the blue light that bounced off the screen spilling onto our foreground character, and this is, of course, known as spill. And the way to get rid of it is by using a spill suppressor. So let me bring back our palettes. And, of course, we can find that in the same keying folder that all of our other keying filters are. Down here at the bottom, spill suppressor, and it does exactly what its name implies that it does. Watch what happens to Steve as I just drag this filter on. By default, it's set to blue, and all of that blue fringe on Steve has now gone away. Of course, if we had shot Steve against a green screen, we would have to actually pick that green color in this color to suppress color chip that you see here. But in this case, we had a full body shot. We needed to use our big blue screen set, and so blue was a perfect color. And in most circumstances, that's all you need to do when it comes to spill suppression is just apply it, check the color. You might want to change it to better accuracy instead of faster, which can help you out in certain circumstances where you have really fine detail in hair and stuff like that. But in most cases, just a quick application of this filter is all you need. Now, I typically follow things up with a matte choker, which is actually going to clean up our edges a little bit. Very often in these steps, you can leave yourself with a little bit of grungy noise just around the edge of a character that might look a little bit unnatural. You don't want to overdo a matte choker, though. A matte choker actually eats in at the edges of the matte that we've created. And if you set those settings too high, you're going to wear away at fine details, and hair and fingers and things like that are going to look unnaturally thin or disappear altogether. But when you do have just a hint of this kind of an edge, a matte choker can really help out with that. So I typically like to apply a matte choker and then adjust the settings so we don't see results quite as extreme as what we're seeing on screen right here. I'll take the geometric softness down to about 2. I'll take the choke value down to about 50. And I'll crank up the gray level softness, which is kind of a post blur on the matte, up to about 20 from 10. And the results there are pretty clean. We've got Steve nicely keyed out, no hint of the blue screen that he was on. Now the next step would be to try to color correct Steve so that he matches more closely the warmth of the color that we see in the scene behind him that we're trying to composite him into. I usually find that it helps in these circumstances to try to get the scene set up more or less where you want it so that you can see how foreground elements interact with background elements, etc. So we're going to shrink Steve down just a little bit here. That's probably a bit too much. Here he is. And once again, if I jump to home and tap the space bar this time, you can see size-wise, he's looking pretty great. But as a result of him being shot in front of a blue background and the scene that we're compositing him into being somewhat warmer, the orange tones of the skin on the hand over here, for example, should, to my eye, be more what Steve's skin tones should be attempting to match. So we're going to now try to isolate these lighter portions of Steve and then bring those into a color space that more closely approximates what we see in the rest of the scene. Now, there are a whole bunch of different ways that we could attempt to do this. There are so many color correction filters inside of After Effects, things like Colorama, obviously hue, saturation, brightness, etc. But I am pretty happy, really, with the way that the shoes and the shirt match the contrast and overall color tone of the background. I'm more concerned about just isolating the skin tone of Steve to the other elements that we see here, which means if I can somehow isolate these from the rest of Steve, then we can just apply a color correction to only that portion. Once again, there's a few different ways of doing that, but in the case of the element that we see here, which has these bright skin areas and everything else is relatively dark, we can actually isolate this with what's known as a high con matte, which essentially means we're going to use a high contrast version of our layer to isolate only either the extreme bright or the extreme dark portions of the layer. The first thing we need to do, however, is to duplicate our layer so that we're working on a copy. So I'm going to come down here to the timeline. Now I do have our Steve layer selected, and there is an effect selected in the associated effect palette for our Steve layer. So before I attempt to duplicate this, I want to make sure that I've deselected everything, because even though I have the layer selected, I also have an effect selected. So if I just hit Control-D or Command-D on the Mac to duplicate, I might end up duplicating the wrong thing, and that could be confusing. So the first thing I want to do is hit F2 to deselect everything. Now I'll click on our Steve layer and hit Control-D, and now we've made a carbon copy of our Steve layer complete with all of the associated effects applied. Now I'm going to turn off the visibility of the backmost version because we know it's okay. I just want to create a foreground version where we can focus on the brighter elements of the layer. Now one other thing I want to warn you about, we've run into this before, is that even though I've duplicated this layer, if I go up now and just click in this palette, which you might be tempted to do, thinking that because this layer is highlighted and these effects are visible, if I click on this palette, the effects palette, it's actually going to highlight the hidden layer because I haven't opened up the associated effects palette for the duplicate layer yet. To do that, I hit F3, and now you'll see I have the associated effects opened up for this duplicate layer, and now we can just start working on this version of Steve. Okay, now we only want to affect the hands and the head. We don't want to affect the pants, which are also relatively light compared to the rest of the body. So I'm going to take another look at the mask that I've got for this layer by turning mask visibility back on again. And I'm going to adjust this mask. I'm going to grab these bottom points here. It's another great reason it's good to use garbage mats. I'm just going to crank up these points until we've basically lopped off poor Steve's legs and left ourselves with just the upper portion of his body to concentrate on. And now I'm going to return to the effects palette, and I'm going to return to our keying filters, and I'm going to find the extract filter, which is right here in the middle. Extract is a Luma key filter, which is exactly what we want. We want to actually key out the darker portions of what's left in our Steve layer and only leave behind the lighter areas to color correct. And that's a perfect job for extract. Let me click on and drag extract onto this layer. Now let's take a look at the extract interface. Now the extract interface is limited somewhat by what I have always believed to be an inaccurate histogram. The histogram is very similar to the histogram we've run into with levels. It should be showing us a nice histogram representation of the brightness and darkness levels, but instead we only get a couple of lines here. So you kind of just have to know how this works and start futzing around with it. But if you click on either the top left or the top right portion of this gray bar that you see here and drag it in, essentially by selecting the left-hand version and dragging it in, we're going to be cropping off the darker portions of the image. See, as I've dragged it to the left, we've started to lose some of the darker portions of the image. And I can drag that over further and further until the darker elements, such as Steve's shirt, have just gone away. Now, if you don't like the hard edge that this leaves us with, you can now grab the lower left-hand version of this gray bar and drag it out left, and that will create a sort of transition zone. If you drag it out too far, you'll see we'll start fading the shirt back in again, which we don't want to do. This creates a smooth transition between the areas we want to keep and the areas that we want to throw away. So what we see on screen here right now does a pretty good job of what we want to do. Of course, if we wanted to crop out the white areas, we would just do exactly the opposite with the top end of this gray bar. But this works pretty well. Now we've isolated these portions of Steve, and to those, let's apply the hue saturation filter. Let me just click in our effects palette and type in hue, and that brings up hue saturation, which I'll drag on to Steve. And now I'm going to crank up our saturation a bit. Let me tab away our palettes again and bring both Steve and the hand into view so you can see what we're trying to match here. Crank up our saturation a bit. Adjust the hue around until we feel like we've got a better match. Might also need to lighten things up a little bit. A little more saturation. It's a fairly subtle adjustment, but that's pretty close. We've now brought a little more orange into his skin so that the relative levels of these two skin tones now match. Let me zoom out just a little bit here and turn on our back version of Steve, and you'll see we've got a better result. Now the skin portions of Steve do a nice job of matching the skin tones that we see to the left, and because we isolated that on a separate layer, we've got the rest of Steve looking just like he belongs in this scene. And of course, if you want to see the difference, you can turn on and off the foreground layer to see that's what it looked like before. He was kind of purpley red. This is what he looks like now. He's a little brighter, a little oranger, and more closely matches the scene. So now we'll just do something similar with the green screen layer that we see back here. This particular green screen is a chromat key. Now, chromat is a cool technology from a company called Reflect Media that we're big fans of here at Total Training. You can find out more information about them at their website. But chromat can save you a ton of money in lights and can also save you a lot of room if you don't have a great big studio to put a giant blue screen in. Anyway, we'll select that hotel layer. Let me bring up our effects palette with Control 5. Once again, let me select the linear color key. There it is. And I'm just going to double click it this time, which will add it to the selected layer, which is the green layer. If I just dragged it and dropped it, I might have accidentally dragged it onto the wrong layer since this is buried several levels deep. And I'll tab my effects palette away again so we can see a little more clearly. Let me pan a little bit over to the right. And this time we need to pick a key color that's nowhere close to the default value of blue. That, of course, is a green. We'll go up here, find a nice saturated medium color of green, and click. And that's going to get rid of most of the green that we see back here. Now all we need to do is either add to that by using the plus eyedropper and picking another green if we wanted to. And that would work pretty well. Or if we wanted, we could also adjust the matching tolerance slider that we see right here by just clicking and dragging on that until we get to a point where we feel we've eaten away just enough of the matte, but not so much that we're wrecking the rest of our matte. See, if I crank this value too far, then some of the green that's reflected on the PowerBook and in the arm here is going to start eating away at the matte as well. So that's a pretty decent key. We might want to follow this up with a spill suppressor. We might not. We do have green light in this scene, which is one reason that we chose to shoot it on a green screen to begin with. And of course, the background elements are green as well. So we can leave the green spill here. We don't have to apply a spill suppressor. And as it turns out, with this current composition, even this little bit of fringe that we see along the edge when rendered at full speed is going to look pretty clean and pretty natural. So I'm not even going to bother with any matte suppression at this point. One last thing I'm going to do, though, to sell this scene. If you look very, very closely, you will see once again something we cropped out a second ago, this black line down the left edge of our layer. There's also a similar, very, very thin black line over on the right-hand side of my screen here. I could crop this out. The trouble is, it's just going to leave empty pixels over here at this point. I've got a foreground layer here of Dave's shoulder. And if I just crop out these black pixels or even key out these black pixels, it's going to leave this thin little line that's going to expose our crowd layer behind there. So some people like to just scale everything up at this point, basically apply a scale filter and just make everything a little bit bigger or stretch it very slightly horizontally. But I think that's kind of a waste of pixel resolution since essentially these small adjustments like that can soften your overall image and result in a lower quality output. So I much prefer to use an adjustment layer and only stretch the portion of the screen that I need to stretch. And if you stretch things over in the edges like this, no one's ever going to notice anyway. Let me jump back to frame 0 by hitting the home key. And I'm going to apply a new adjustment layer on top of our entire scene here. And to this layer, let me bring up my palettes again. I'm going to apply Mesh Warp. Just double click on that. Now I don't need anywhere near as many rows and columns that you see here, but you can't just take Mesh Warp and set everything down to 1. So let's pick some smaller values. I'll just say 3 rows and maybe 5 columns. And if we look closely now at the results, you'll see that I've got 5 columns going across and 3 rows to deal with here. And if I just select these corner points of Mesh Warp by shift-clicking on just these portions, I can now hold up on the Shift key, and now that they're selected, just click and drag very slightly to the left. And when I do, I'm just stretching out this portion of the mesh, just this portion of the image, leaving the rest of the image pixel perfect. And this smooth stretching will mask the little black bar that we see on the left, but otherwise leave a flawless composite behind, and no one will ever notice this tiny little bit of stretching over on the left-hand side of the screen. I can pan over and do the same thing on the right. Just a very, very slight adjustment is all that's required over here on the right. And now all that's left is to render this out, and I'll have a really terrific composite. Now, of course, there's other things we could do to sell this shot. We could add a little drop shadow behind Steve, for example, or even a reflection in the surface of the podium, both of which we did for the commercial. But the key elements are there, pun intended. However, we've only used a small handful of After Effects keying filters. And if I return us to our keying folder, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of different keys in here. Color difference key, color key, which is, of course, a standard version that's not worth using. The color range filter, difference mat, extract. Some of them are 16-bit, some not. Which key filter do I use for which situation? Well, beginning with After Effects 6, the answer is almost always key light. This new filter that has been included with the After Effects 6 Pro bundle is really the answer to almost all of your keying needs. It brings together into a single package a lot of the stuff that I just showed you and a whole bunch else besides. So rather than go through all of these other filters that you're probably not going to need anymore, I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time in this lesson focusing on the ins and outs of using Keylight, the Academy Award-winning filter that's now included as part of After Effects. So let's close down this composition, and now let's open up the second Steve composition that we have to work with here, Steve on PowerBook. Now here we'll find a very similar shot to what we had before. We've got Steve once again on a blue screen. Now this time, because we needed him sitting down, we actually put some blue boxes in here, which was really kind of wasted effort, frankly, because there's no way these blue boxes are going to key out in any sort of useful way. But we did have Steve hold his legs really still, so we were able with a very simple mask to mask out the blue boxes that you see down here. However, I've got this mask set to none. I'm going to actually let the Keylight filter use this mask to remove this data. And I haven't even bothered to mask out the edge over here on the left or any of the junk over here on the right. I'm also going to use tools inside of Keylight to do that for us as well. I've only masked out the little box that he's sitting on. So let me turn the masks off for this composition as well. And let me show you the background layer that we're going to be compositing against. I'll turn off Steve here. And we're basically going to be putting Steve on the upper left-hand corner of this PowerBook that we see here being operated by Dave Helmley in our Las Vegas hotel room, as you've seen in our Total Training commercial. And to get really existential, I've actually corner pinned the current screen onto the PowerBook here, so we actually see the exact shot that we're going to be creating being created here on this PowerBook. Boy, if that doesn't bend your mind, I don't know what will. So let's turn on the Steve layer again, and we're going to apply the Keylight filter to our Steve layer. Let me just drag that on, tab away our palettes, and let's see exactly how this filter works. Now, there's a lot of stuff in this filter, but don't let that make you too nervous. Most of what's in this filter mimics to some degree some of the things that I've shown you already. And when they don't, they're just there to make your life much, much easier. For example, even cropping the edges of a layer off can be handled here in the Source Crops section, where I can crop the left edge off by cranking on the left switch until our microphone cable goes away. Now, I'm using the word crop here, but you'll also notice that we're actually only stretching the pixels on the side. That's because the pixels are set to repeat in this X method and Y method pop-up here. You could also reflect the pixels if you wanted to, or fill with a solid color, or wrap the other side of the image around. But for blue screen stuff, just stretching the pixels out by using repeat is the easiest way to create, at least in this case, a nice seamless blue that's going to key very well. I can crop the right edge down until our lighting equipment goes away. I can also use the mask that we drew by turning open the outside mask setting here and choosing the mask that we set, which immediately renders that invisible. And now all that we have to do is key out this blue. Once again, it's very simple. Now the Keylight plugin is optimized for blue or green screen. It's not really designed to handle other colors terribly well. It's optimized for blue or green. But it comes up by default with no screen color assigned, because it's always going to want you to pick the best blue that you can see, rather than maybe giving you the mistaken impression that it automatically generates a great mask. So just click on the eyedropper tool and pick a nice medium blue. Now at first glance, it may appear that we've got a decent key here. I think we're obviously over-keying a little bit because Steve has become a little bit transparent. We can actually see the screen through him, which we clearly don't want to do. Also, if we look down in the lower right-hand corner, you can see those stretched pixels that we created are also not completely keyed out and are creating a streaky effect down there. But otherwise, things look reasonably clean. And this brings up a fairly important point. No matter how clean or how dirty a matte is, the real important thing is the final results, the final render, and whether or not it looks convincing or not. So a lot of the tools I'm going to show you for cleaning up mattes may or may not be completely necessary, depending on exactly how accurate you want to be with this stuff. Let's take a look at the keylight controls and see how we can analyze the work that we've just done to see how much work we have left to do. So let's take a closer look at the keylight plugin and see how some of its controls can help us analyze our mattes. I'm going to move our effects control palette over a little bit, and I'm also going to expand it out so that we can read the full names of our parameters here. One of the most important parameters inside Keylight is this very first one. View Final Result is only one of many, many choices that we can select inside this pop-up. Some of the other important ones are the Status pop-up, which we'll come back to exactly what this means a little bit later. It looks like a mess, but this is actually a really very useful view, as you'll see in a bit. The Source, all the way up at the top, of course, shows us our original image, which can be useful. The intermediate result shows us the keyed version without any color correction, so the RGB values don't change, only the alpha values change. And the screen matte controls allows us to see exactly and accurately how good a matte we have. And by looking at this, we can see pretty clearly that Steve's got some intermediate gray pixels in his shirt and in his pants that are resulting in a little bit of transparency. And our background, which is supposed to be completely black, showing that it's completely transparent, actually has some gray streaks that we saw just a second ago. Now, even in this case, there may be some not quite transparent things in this otherwise black area up here, because the gamma of most computer monitors doesn't allow us to see a lot of detail in anything much darker than 75% black, which is why we have that status view, and I'll show you how that works in just a second. But for now, what we can do is adjust the screen strength slider that you see here, which is actually similar to the matching tolerance slider that we saw a little bit earlier in the linear color key. By cranking up the screen strength, you can see in our window there that the background is getting progressively darker as we're keying out more and more blue. Remember, we don't need to worry about this box stuff. That's going to be handled by the mask that we drew. But we do need to be aware that as we adjust the screen strength up, we're also keying out more and more of the blue spill that came over into Steve's clothes here. So there's ways to correct for that as well. You can try adjusting the screen balance. Knocking that over to the left will sometimes brighten things up. But in our case, it's not going to brighten things up enough. So I'm going to undo that and just leave it the way it is. And instead, let's go down to the Screen Matte section, which allows us to post-process the screen in ways that are powerful, but you have to be really careful with them. In this case, what we're going to do is adjust the clip white setting, which is sort of like the input white setting on the levels command. This is basically going to clip anything above a certain value to white, and we set that value by adjusting the slider down. And by dragging this to the left, we're essentially going to be filling in the lighter areas of our screen. And again, we don't want to concern ourselves with any of this stuff around the boxes here. We just want to make sure that we have a nice opaque fill inside of Steve, and we don't want to take it so far that we start ruining our edges here either. So now that we've done that, let's switch back over to view our final results, and you'll see we have a pretty decent key here. Now at this point in the process, the last time, we applied a spill suppressor because we still had a whole bunch of blue around the edge of our character here. But we don't have that problem this time because spill suppression is by default built into the keylight filter. As soon as you pick a screen color with the eyedropper, it immediately spill suppresses that color from the edges. If you want to view what it would look like without spill suppression, pick the intermediate result, and you'll see this is what we would have looked like, this nice, incredible blue fringe around everything. This is what we would have looked like had the spill suppression not been built into Keylight, but it is, so when we turn on the final result, you'll see all of that color is suppressed. And Keylight does a brilliant job of spill suppression as well. The two sliders that you see here, despill bias and alpha bias, are actually tied together by default. We'll probably see more examples of this as we move on, but the idea behind this is if you want to suppress more of a color than Keylight does by default, you would crank the despill bias into a positive direction. And if you wanted to suppress less, for example, if you wanted to leave a little bit of the blue in our image here, you would crank this to the left. But particularly in areas where there are soft levels of transparency, for example, maybe in someone's hair, you would want to have these linked together because the transparency of a pixel affects its perceived color as well. So when you adjust the bias of one of these, you want to adjust the bias of both of them in most situations. You do have the ability to turn this off if you want to adjust the color separate from the alpha channel. But that's what these bias controls are all about, controlling the spill that is otherwise automatically applied by this filter. Now at this point, we have a terrific key. I don't think we need to do anything else with this. We'll be exploring this filter in several other compositions moving forward, but now all I need to do is complete this by sizing our layer down and then doing a little bit of color correction. So let's first of all size our layer down somewhere around here or so. We'll drag him up on the corner of the screen so his hand's resting on the corner. That looks pretty good. And now we need to bring him into a color space that more or less matches the green tone of the rest of the room. Well, color correction is built into Keylight as well. If we go to the bottom of our Keylight plugin here, you'll see foreground color correction. This is just a sort of gross color correction to the entire layer. It applies to everything in the layer. Twirl that open, enable color correction with the little switch that you see here, and this is where it gets really, really fun. You can suppress color if you want to. You can just tell it to get rid of all of the reds or all the greens or all the blues or cyan, magenta, yellow, whatever, or some percentage by the values that you adjust here. Or you can actually twirl open this color balance setting and this color balance wheel and just kind of look at the overall color you're looking to match. I know we have a green room here that has kind of a green tone. So if I just click a little towards the green here, it's going to do a really nice job of sort of adjusting the overall color of our layer so that it more suitably fits into this green space. So a couple of clicks here. You can, of course, adjust the hue or the saturation if you like directly. Also, you can adjust perhaps the contrast to crank up the darkness and brightness of the image if you like. I think a slightly higher contrast value works well for us with Steve so that his shirt stands out a little bit better against that background. You can adjust the saturation, the brightness, etc. All of this color correction can happen within the Keylight plugin, so you don't have to apply a separate filter to accomplish color correction. We're also going to show in a subsequent lesson how you can even isolate just the edges of a layer for color correction. But that's an introduction to how Keylight works. Now let's take a closer look at some of the underlying technology that's really important to interacting well with Keylight. Let me close down this composition, and let's open up the next composition on our list, 3-LoRa. Now this is a standard keying problem. Well, actually this is a little video of Laura Parada, who is Total Training's production coordinator, but she's demonstrating a problem that one often runs into in keying, and that is how to handle areas of intermediate transparency. In this case, hair is a classic example where you have a nice green background. This is Laura shot against a chromat green screen, so we have a terrific green screen back here, and she's well lit, but we have these areas of intermediate transparency between solid opaque hair and transparency beyond the edges of the hair. How well does Keylight handle this kind of a keying situation? Well, as it turns out, it handles it very, very well. Let me bring up our effects palettes again and add the Keylight filter to the LoRa layer. Let me bring in our effects palette a little bit, expand it out so we can see everything that we're doing, and I'll tab away my other palettes. And let's take a closer look at this plugin. Let me move our subject over so we have a better view of hair, etc. And of course, we're going to pick as our screen color this great green that we have here. And now we can see her nicely keyed just with a single click against this kind of greenish water background. There's a little bit of spill still in her hair that we could correct for. But all in all, it's not too bad of a key with a single click. Now we could look to adjusting this edge, this little bit of spill that we see here. But before we do, I have a sneaking suspicion that this mat is not as good as we think it is. If we go over and check out our views, and instead of the final result, for example, if we just look at the screen mat, you can see, sure enough, there are some areas of transparency in here still to be addressed. And if we go over to our status view, we'll find out something really interesting about this image. Now, the status view is really a utility view. This is a working view that gives us some very, very interesting information. What the status view gives us by default is 3 colors. The colors are black, white, and medium gray. Any pixel that you see here that's black is completely transparent. Any pixel that you see that's white is completely opaque. And any pixel that you see that's medium gray represents some level of transparency in this image. So if we go over to our screen strength and adjust this value up from 100, you'll see with only a couple of adjustments, we can quickly get to a point, maybe around 107% or so, where we have completely gotten rid of the noise that was present in our green screen background. So obviously, those little partially opaque pixels that we saw a second ago weren't very opaque at all, but now they're completely gone, which is very useful. But we obviously have some areas of trouble in our foreground. And again, we can try to adjust the screen balance if we like. Drag that to the left a ways, and you can see that we can adjust our screen somewhat, but frankly, not enough. This is essentially doing sort of a gamma control on the results, and no matter how far I drag this slider, I won't get rid of the gray pixels in our foreground element that are representing some level of transparency. And in fact, we're actually going to end up with some sharp edges that are sort of undesirable. So I'm going to crank our screen balance back over a little closer to where it started. And instead, let's check out our screen matte settings. We've been here before. And once again, I'm going to adjust the clip white setting. Now I'm going to have to crank this quite a ways to the left before all of the pixel values begin to disappear. And once they finally disappear, you'll also notice that now we've got these little faded green pixels on screen. The green pixels here are telling us that because I have clipped out these white values, the color adjustment that it was making automatically with the spill suppressor is now no longer valid in these areas that you see that are green. So these are not going to be properly color corrected. There's ways to adjust for that as well by using the replace color command that you see down here. I could pick a value here, and it would have replaced those green pixels with that value. But the subtleness of what we're seeing here is so extreme that it's very, very unlikely that any of these internal pixels are going to be much of a bother. The edge, however, is a different story. So what we're seeing here is white representing completely opaque now. We've done a nice job of having our foreground element be opaque, and black represents completely transparent, but we've left ourselves with a very small area of intermediate transparency. And that's not going to look really good. So let's go back to our finished version. Instead of status, let's look at our final results. And you'll see, sure enough, we've got a great opaque foreground element. Our background is completely transparent, but all of those wonderful intermediate levels of transparency are now gone. And we're left with an unnaturally sharp edge with a little bit of a halo around it on this portion of our subject. And of course, the transparent areas of our hair, which should be rich in detail and show through a lot more of the background, look, I don't know, acceptable in a worst case scenario, but we can make these look an awful lot better. And I'll show you how. Let's go back to our status view, which shows us the edge that we have to work with here. And you'll remember that we used this clip white value to get rid of all of the transparent pixels in our foreground subject. Once you've done this, once you've adjusted clip black and or clip white, as we did, you can then go back to this control called clip rollback. And what clip rollback will do is it'll essentially look and do an edge detection on what we have here, and it will, without adding noise into the main portion of our selection or our screen, it will add transparency detail back into the edges of our subject. So as I drag that to the right, you'll see these areas of transparency now become more pronounced than they were. This is what it looked like a second ago. I undid. And this is what it looks like now. I hit Control-Shift-Z to redo. So what's the result of this? Well, let's go back to our view, choose Final Result, and you'll see now we have much more transparent detail in the hair than what we had before. And from this view, we can keep adjusting this clip rollback up. You can actually start to see artifacts beginning to show up in the neck here if you crank it up too high. So we're going to crank that value back down again. And with fine adjustments of the clip rollback control, we can reintroduce fine details in hair or any other transparency in a key. Now we have carefully adjusted the transparency of this key. So if we go up now and start cranking up the despill bias again to remove just a little more of the spill color from our subject, and we can be very, very subtle in this adjustment. We don't need to go much more than 10 or so. But we're also going to be simultaneously adjusting the alpha, and that may look okay. In this case, it doesn't look bad. But if you found that you wanted to keep the alpha untouched while being able to override an automatic spill suppression, you can turn off the switch that says lock biases together. And that way you could leave the alpha bias at, say, 0, while simply adjusting the spill suppression a little bit higher to get rid of some of the green. Now this looks pretty good on my screen. Not sure how good it looks on yours. Everything's subjective, of course, and you'll have to make artistic choices based on what you're seeing. But for now, this looks pretty good. Now let's take just a little bit of a sidetrack and talk a little bit more about chromat. Let me close this down. I've got two clips in this next composition, both of them shot against chromat. One of them shot well, and one of them shot, well, not so well. So this was fairly early on with our experience with chromat, and we hadn't really learned the ins and outs of working with it. The shot that you see here, we thought when we were shooting it would actually key really well. But it turns out that while this is a nice uniform green and it keys okay, it sure could have been a whole lot better. In particular, this area of transition right where Deke's face meets his shoulder is extremely challenging to work with because it drops off so much. And a quick glance at the individual red, green, and blue channels for this layer will show us that we've got, pretty good separation between the background and the foreground and the red channel. The green channel, however, is the one we're supposed to be keying. And the green, there's almost as much green in the foreground as there is in the background. This is not a distinctive green screen at all. And the blue channel, well, there's hardly any blue in the scene to speak of. So this is an okay green, but it's not a great green. To really get a great green, you need to light your screen well. The key, as it turns out, pun intended again, is that you need to set the camera iris to properly expose the chromat before you light the rest of the scene. In this case, we lit the scene, and then we just turned on the chromat light, and it turned out that the iris for the camera shut itself down based on all the light hitting the scene, and so what was bouncing back off the chromat screen was not terribly intense. If we look at the PD layer here, which is the good layer, you'll see a nice example of a screen where we lit the chromat material on the floor and the screen behind PD here. We lit that first and then lit the foreground character. And the results, if we look at the blue channel, well, they kind of speak for themselves. This keys unbelievably easily and even preserves the detail of things like this little tassel bouncing around, which was almost impossible for us to do against a traditional blue screen background. And we can see the difference in working with these clips as soon as we try to key them. We bring up our effects palette once again. Let's apply key light to our PD layer here. I'll tab away those palettes and bring our effects palette in where we can see it. Once again, this time we'll just choose the screen color. Immediately drops away. We have a lot of stuff we need to crop out here, so let's open up our source crops and adjust in our left view until the microphone cable goes away. It's not bad. The right view we can drag down until that chunk goes away. Not bad. And the bottom we'll adjust up until that goes away. And that's pretty good. Oops. Went a little bit too far with our crops, and you'll see the results there. So let me adjust that left-hand crop back out just a ways. We could, of course, also use a mask for that, but we'll just use the crop controls for now. And without going into too much effort on making this a really great key, we'll drag him down where he belongs. We can see that we have a little bit of a haze. If you look really, really closely here, you'll see the background hasn't keyed itself out particularly well. And we also seem to have a little bit of a line there at the top of the screen that we should probably crop out. Let me just enter a value of, say, 98 for our top crop, and that gets rid of that. But let's get rid of this haze. Let's go over to our status. Once again, you'll see almost none of the background is completely opaque, so we can adjust our strength up until the background goes away. There we go. Now part of his shoes are beginning to vanish, so once again, let's go down to our screen mat and adjust our clip white settings until we get the shoes back. And once again, we're not going to over-obsess on this particular key. Let's switch back to our final result. And the results are pretty good. We could color correct this, but for now, let's take a look instead at our background layer. And once again, let me tab my palettes back into place, and we'll drag the key light filter this time onto the deke layer. The ultimate result of this is that we're going to be keying this green background so that we can place deke and PD against a more natural environment that suits their relationship. And of course, in our case, that environment is a live volcano. See, going off back there, a little lava. The color matched really well. I thought that was pretty nice. But this key by default is much dirtier than the PD key. There's a lot of schmutz going on in the window. And because this background element was not shot terribly well, it's going to take an awful lot of effort to get this screen to look good. I can switch over to our status window again. You'll see all the noise we have to work with here. We can crank the screen strength up and get rid of most of the mess in the background. We can adjust our screen balance down just a little bit and go down to our screen mat and adjust our clipping down just as we've done before. But whatever we do, because this was a poorly shot screen, it's going to be almost impossible for us to adjust a single key that's going to result in a really good, clean, finished product that does not include a little bit of schmutz here and some bad edges, because we shot a bad screen to begin with. The better you shoot the footage on the front end, the easier the key is going to be on the back end, and the less of this kind of work you're going to have to do. So there's a lot of ways to solve this problem. They all involve a fair amount of tedium. Now, we can try to brute force our way out of a problem like this by using some of the other controls inside of Keylight that allow us to soften up this mat, eat into the mat, but almost every one of them that's going to make this portion of the mat look good is going to make other portions of the mat look crummy. So we can actually shrink the mat a bit by clicking and dragging to the left on the Grow Shrink Mat. And as you'll see, sure enough, we're eating into the mat here, but we're also making Deke's head look unnaturally eaten away. Obviously, if we drag it in far enough, it looks just really terrible. But even a value of -3 or -4 is going to give us a little bit of artifacting. We're going to lose his eyebrow. We're now kind of cutting into his actual eye. And so those results aren't really going to be good for a finished professional key. Now you can soften up the screen in conjunction with growing it and shrinking it and try to bring some of that detail back, but then you end up with this kind of haloing effect around things, and ultimately you haven't really gained much. You see a lot of keys that look like this, frankly, and they're never convincing, these soft, blurred-edged keys that people resort to deal with problems like shooting on, for example, DV, where the edges get really artifacty. Sometimes there's no way around it but to blur the edges. But really the best way to deal with a problem like this is either go in and paint out by hand the little bits of schmutz that you see using the paint tools in After Effects, or we could isolate this portion of the composition and apply a single key to this portion of his face while applying a separate key to the rest of the image. And we're not going to do that with this particular comp, but I'll show you how to do that with another comp in just a second. Before we leave this one, though, I want to talk a little more about the idea of selling a composition like this. And part of it is just the details that you add in. For example, one of the details that we like to use whenever we have PD the Elf featured in one of our scenes is we add a drop shadow into the scene, and that drop shadow really does kind of help sell the scene and give the impression that our character is actually standing on the desk. Now, how do you add a drop shadow? Well, you can't just use the drop shadow command, because that's completely two-dimensional. We need to actually create a sort of fake drop shadow that stretches out from where his feet come in contact with the desk. Turns out that's not terribly difficult to do. Now that we've selected our PD the Elf character, let me bring back our palettes, and let's apply the Fill filter. Actually, before we apply Fill, I'm going to hit F2 to make sure everything's deselected. I'm going to click on PD and I'm going to duplicate him. Because the work that I'm about to do, I want to apply to a copy of our PD the Elf character. And the copy we want to apply it to is the copy that's in back here. So we've got two copies of our PD layer. I'm selecting the backmost copy, and now I'm going to apply fill to that layer. Don't see anything happen on screen because that layer is now obscured by the frontmost layer. But if I click on our front layer, you see that the fill command has filled our PD the Elf character with solid red. Obviously, we don't want a red shadow. We want a black shadow. So I'll just grab our eyedropper tool and go in here and pick a nice dark color that matches with the dark colors from our scene here. So that's given us basically the color of our shadow. Now let's apply the transform filter. So I just typed in TRANS, and we'll apply that filter as well to our PD the Elf fill filter. I'm going to collapse down our key light effect and our fill effect, and let's just concentrate on transform now. I'll tab the palettes away, move PD over a little further so we can see him. The first thing I want to do is bring the anchor point down to his toes, because that's where we want the distortion to take place around. So I'm going to click down here at his toes. Now, because we've moved the anchor point, the whole layer itself shifts. So we need to compensate for that. I'm not going to bother explaining why this works, but trust me, it does. If we now go set the position values here to the same values as the anchor point values, so 352, and tab over and type in 413.7 and return, they cancel each other out. And now the layer returns to the place that it started from, but now the anchor point around which all the transformations are going to take place is now set at his toes, where we started out here. So now what I want to do is scale our shadow down. But oops, by just adjusting the scale slider, I am uniformly scaling. Don't want to do that. So let me undo, turn off uniform scale. Now I just want to scale down the height of our PD layer. So it's something like this. And now I want to adjust the skew of our PD layer. If I crank on the skew setting, you'll see that sure enough, the shadow's skewing, but it's skewing up and down. I don't want to do that. I want it to skew right and left. And we do that by adjusting the skew axis here. If I crank that over to about 90 degrees or so, in fact, even maybe a little beyond 90, so that it matches the angle of the desk here. Now when I adjust the skew value, I'll skew off left. It's probably not accurate to the actual shadow in the room, but it'll do just fine. And now when I turn back on my original front PD layer, I've now created a shadow that animates and is based on the same alpha channel that I generated when I keyed the foreground PD element to begin with. And of course, at this point, we can take our background layer and we could adjust its transparency if we wanted to. We could crank the opacity down to something much more subtle, but something that we could still clearly see in our composition, which will help sell that comp. So once again, I'm not going to take the time at this point to fix the background deke image. We're going to talk about isolating separate portions of an image in just a second. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit more about subtle color correction. So let's open up the Brian on desk composition here. And we're going to basically go through the same steps we've gone through before to create a simple little composite here. But we're also going to address some additional color correction capabilities inside Keylight. So let me hit the home key to take us back to frame 0. Let's select our front layer here, which is me standing against a nicely lit blue screen. I'm going to bring up our effects palette. I'll type in Keylight, or K-E-Y-L is all I need to type, and we'll add that to the Brian layer. We'll choose the blue color that we want to key out. I'll very quickly check the status to make sure that we have a decent key. Let's adjust our screen strength. It's not going to take much to get rid of that blue. And adjust our screen matte a little bit here to clip the white out and get a nice foreground element. That looks pretty good. And then let's check our final result and see that we've got a pretty decent key. But obviously, the color of this composition could match a little bit better. I don't know how clear it is on your television set, but at least here on my computer monitor, the foreground element is much too pink for the background element. And we can do a little bit of color correction here. If I go down here to the foreground color correction tool that we used before and enable color correction and turn on my color balancing, open up the color balance wheel, and let's just shift things a little bit into the orange. This has gotten us almost where we need to be. But once again, it may not be terribly clear to you on your television set, but it sure is on the computer monitor. The blurriness in the hand here is far too saturated. This doesn't look realistic at all. This is a really bright red haze around things. So one of the things that the key light filter gives us to adjust this sort of situation is color correction tools that are designed specifically to work with the edge of your subject, not the entire subject, just the edge. So if we twirl open the edge color correction tools, you'll see we have many of the same color correction tools that we have in our foreground color correction, but in addition to that, we have these controls that are marked edge hardness, edge softness, edge grow, and that allows us to choose just how much of our composition is defined by the term edge. Now, a quick way to see that is to scroll back up to our views, and one of the views that we have to choose from is the color correction edges view. And that shows us basically what we'll be adjusting with the color corrections that we make down here in the edge color correction. So if I wanted to grow the edge, you would see the results of that immediately in the color correction mask. And the edge softness, which softens the transition area between the edge and the foreground element, becomes incredibly clear when you check out that view. So let's go back up and view our final result, because ultimately that's what's important. And the main color correction that I want to do here, and we won't do it to quite as much as we just did. We'll set that amount of edge down a little bit. I want to desaturate my edge a bit because this blurred section is just too hot. So if I now take my saturation value and crank it down, you'll see I'm able to adjust down the saturation of the edge independent from the interior of our layer. Obviously, the amount of the layer is a little bit too much, so I'm going to crank that value down to something like 2 or 3, and I'm going to take the softness down a bit as well to a value no more than, say, 6 or 7. And that pretty much isolates just the edges of our composite and allows me to crank that saturation value down to something that serves the final composite a lot better. And to my eye, that looks pretty good. So the color correction tools inside Keylight not only allow you to globally color correct, but also allow you to isolate the edges of a layer and apply separate color correction just to the edges. Now, another effective way of isolating portions of an image to color correct versus not color correct is with using what's called a holdout mat. And of course, Keylight has controls to work with holdout mats as well. So let me close this down, and we'll open up the next composition, the Brian composition. Double click on that. And what we have here is your goofy host shot in front of a green screen. And in this case, you can see one of the things that comes up every now and then with Keylight and an individual who, like myself, wears glasses. Even though these are anti-reflective glasses, I can still get them at the right angle where if I look really closely in the glasses, you can see I'm getting a green reflection in the lenses. Now, this is an extreme example of what you may run into in other situations where maybe you're shooting somebody with blue eyes in front of a blue screen. And when you key out the blue really well, all of a sudden their eyes go transparent, and that's no good. So we need a way to isolate this portion of the image from the rest of the image and tell Keylight to key this stuff, but not key this stuff. Let's take it one step at a time. I'll zoom back out again. Let me bring up my palettes. Here's Keylight. We'll apply that. Let me bring over my effects control palette and tab away my other palettes and open up my window here. Once again, we're going to just choose the screen color we want to work with. A quick click, and we have a really nice key. Even a close look reveals that we've really preserved with this plugin incredible detail in my mostly balding but still somewhat hairy head. Look at the detail in here and how well it's preserved and how nice this composites with just a single click against the background. But if we examine our screen mat more closely, you'll see that sure enough, I'm actually keying out holes where my eyes should be. Now I can fine-tune the strength of the screen. I don't need to adjust it much, but maybe up to 102 or 103%. And once again, I want to go down to my screen mat and adjust my clip white a little bit. But I would have to go pretty far and start wrecking my nice clean edges to actually get rid of these holes where my eyes are. So I need to use another technique to plug up my eyes, and that technique is known as a holdout mat. We're also going to use this opportunity to adjust two different portions of the screen using different settings in Keylight. And the reason we're going to need to do that is because when we shot this scene, we shot it with sharpening on in the camera. And this is a big no-no. You really don't want to do this. What sharpening does is it finds areas of contrast between light and dark. And of course, there's no more obvious area of contrast than a body in front of a blue screen. And it takes the lighter area and lightens it up even a little bit more. And it takes the darker edge and darkens that edge up even a little bit more. So the result of this after we key it is that there's going to be this kind of black and white stripe around everything that's not going to key very well. Or put it this way, in order to key this hard edge portion well, we're going to have to wreck this soft edge portion of the mask. So what I'm going to use is an inner holdout mat to preserve the green in the eyeballs here, and an outer mat that's going to allow me to key separate portions of this image using different key light settings. So let me zoom out real quick here. Let me pan over, and I'm going to hit the G key to get my pen tool here. And let me draw a couple of quick masks. The first one is going to be around the eyes. That's essentially going to be mask number 1, which is going to tell Keylight to hang on to this stuff. Now, we don't want the mask to actually apply itself to the image. We're just going to use this mask as a tool for Keylight. So I want to actually hit the letter M to reveal our mask down here in the timeline. And in the pop-up next to the mask name, I'm going to choose, instead of add, none. So the mask now exists here in the timeline, but it's not actually doing anything. All right? Now, the next thing I want to do is draw a second larger mask out here, and I'm going to have that mask actually intersect my neck somewhere around the point where the fuzzy part stops being fuzzy and turns to this sharp edge. We can go down here if we like. It doesn't really matter. Let me close that off, and once again, I'll need to go down to my mask settings and set the mode for mask 2 to none. So now I have a couple of working masks up here. Let's see how we use them in conjunction with Keylight. First of all, let's go back and view our final results again. There's the keyed version with the final results. Now let me zoom in a little bit so we can see more clearly what's going on with my eyes here. It's kind of an illusion. It looks okay here, but we are actually seeing the blue background through my eyes here. It's kind of hard for you to see on your monitor, but it really is there. But if we go down to our inside mask and outside mask controls, for my inside mask, I can choose mask number 1, and you'll see immediately the color comes back into my eyes because I've told it that I want to use mask number 1 as a holdout mat. And that means that no transparency information is going to be changed inside this area at all. Next, I want to go down to my outside mask and choose mask number 2. Now, the way that garbage mats work inside Keylight is they actually want you to draw a mask around the thing you want to throw away. Now, we, in this instance, drew a mask around something we wanted to keep, which was my head. So we want to turn on the invert button, and that'll bring back my head and get rid of my body. So now we have this lovely key that's applied itself to my hair and to my nice little floating head here. And I'm going to zoom out a click. And just as we've done a couple other times in this lesson, I'm going to hit the F2 key to deselect everything. Actually, that only deselected the Keylight filter because that's the window that's active. Let me click down here in the timeline, and that deselects this particular layer. Now I know that I have no properties selected, no effects selected or anything. I'm going to reselect the layer name and hit duplicate. I've now created an exact copy of my floating head here. Let me hit the F3 key to bring up the effect control palette for the copy. I'm going to scroll back down now to our outside mask and turn off the invert button. So that means this copy is now affecting only the bottom portion of our mask, the portion that's not my head, and any adjustments we make now that will hopefully fix this ugly sharpening edge that we see right here will not apply to the nice fuzzy hair that we see up there. So we've effectively isolated these two portions from each other, and now we can apply different effects to the lower portion to clean up this key. And what we want to go to is this destructive portion that I really don't like to use unless I absolutely have to, and that's the screen softness setting, which we'll set up to a value of maybe 2. And then we're going to shrink down. Let's try a -2 value and see what that gives us. Well, it's kind of subtle, but it's definitely an improvement. Let me shrink it down maybe a little bit more, -3 or so. That's good. It's starting to soften the edge there around the shoulders. It blends it much more nicely and much more believably into the background on both sides. Yep, looks pretty good, while maintaining the detail around the head, the detail around the hair, etc. And because these two are working off of the same shared mask, the join between the two clips is seamless and perfect. Now the last thing that we might want to do is go back in and adjust this inner mask selection a little bit, because there is a very clear spill going on here with this holdout mask. So let's go back and select our backmost layer, open up the inside mask setting, and let's soften up that selection a little bit. By softening that up, we'll soften the transition zone between the holdout area and the main portion of the key. Now the last thing I want to do is get rid of this green. Now remember, before it looked like we were getting rid of the green, but what we were actually doing was keying out the green, so we were leaving holes in here. What I want to do is just neutralize this color. And we can do that down in our foreground color correction, enable color correction, go into the color suppression section, and under suppress, choose green. Now when I choose this, watch my eyes. Boom. Suppressed, gone. Just that bright green section is gone. The problem is solved, but we've maintained the integrity of our key. So that is a pretty thorough look at KeyLight and the wonderful stuff that you can do with it. Now, before we leave keying altogether, I do want to point out one other keying filter that you may need from time to time that's part of the After Effects production bundle. It's called the inner-outer key, and we're going to look at it by opening up this project number 7 bottle. I'm going to tab my palettes back into place. And under our keying section, this time I want to start with the extract filter. We talked about it a second ago, but I'm going to start with it on this image because you might assume that it's the way to go with an image like this, because we've got a fairly light foreground object against an almost black background object. But extract is actually not going to serve us too well here. It is going to allow us to pull a reasonable facsimile of a key. If I drag this over to the left, you'll see sure enough the darker areas do disappear. But even if I decide to choose just blue instead of luminance as a channel, it still becomes very, very difficult to pull a key that includes the bottle but doesn't also include portions of the label that happen to get too dark. You can do a pretty decent job with this, but you can clearly see that in portions of the label here, the background is actually showing through and animating through. So it's not really a terribly good key. It's okay, but it's not terribly, terribly good. Instead, I'm going to try using the inner-outer key. And the way that works is if you find yourself in a situation where you need to isolate an element from the background, but you haven't been fortunate enough to be able to set up your element against a blue screen or a green screen or any color screen, you can actually use rough masks to tell After Effects what's supposed to be the foreground and what's supposed to be the background. Now you might think, well, I could just mask this shape anyway. It's just a rotating bottle. The shape doesn't really change that much. I mean, there's a little bit of roto work I'd need to do at the bottom. And you know what? You're right. You actually could. But there are some details, if we zoom in. If you look, as the bottle spins, there's all these little droplets of water. Look at the edge here. There's all these little droplets of water that are poking out and stuff that really do add to the detail of the bottle, that if we were to just simply draw a mask, it would be very, very difficult to roto all those droplets as well, and very painstaking. But if we just use a couple of rough masks, and if I turn on my mask switch here, you'll see I've already drawn a couple. These aren't terribly accurate masks. The only important thing about these masks is that the one on the inside, which I've labeled inner, is always on the inside of the edge of the item that I want to key, always stays inside. And the other one is just outside the edge that I want to keep. So as I spin this around, you'll see while they're not accurately describing the outline of this object, they are basically living either just inside or just outside of that object. So I can use these masks with the inner-outer key plugin, which I'll now apply from the keying filter here just by dragging it on. Now let me zoom out. If I go to the inner-outer key, all I have to do is tell it what mask I want to use to define the foreground, what mask I want to use to define the background. For the foreground, I'll pick inside. For the background, I'll pick outside. And the results are that anything inside the inner mask remain completely opaque, anything outside the outer mask are completely transparent, and it does a great job of finding the edge in between those two masks and creating a really nice key that also happens to include the details that we were hoping to preserve along the edge of the bottle. So the inner-outer key, it's not great for everything, and it still does require a fair amount of roto work on your part to create these rough masks, but they can be rough. They don't have to be accurate. They don't have to be nearly as painstaking as most rotoscoping work that you do. So the inner-outer key can help save your skin in tight situations. But for almost every other keying job, particularly jobs where you have the luxury of creating a well-lit blue screen or green screen, use Keylight. It's an incredibly powerful addition to the After Effects toolset.